So today I'm here to talk to you about the changing landscape of women's careers within the financial services context. But first of all, before I start, just a little bit about us. So ECC started in 1994, and our interest in the female career was piqued by the fact that we almost exclusively were coaching men in senior leadership roles. And it made us ask the question, why are there so few women? And we quickly realized that the pinch point was maternity. So we launched maternity coaching, which quickly morphed into parental transition coaching. And over time, we've become specialists in the female career. And what we do in particular is we advocate for companies to do more for their working parents. It's about having a rich personal life as well as having an interesting and fulfilling career. And let's face it, never more so than now. I think during this pandemic, we've had a genuine insight into gender equity and the pressure parents are under. So I'm going to start with highlighting a few stats to set the scene, okay? So we've made some strides. Women now make up 43% of the workforce in UK financial services. But when you dig a bit deeper, you can see quite a few imbalances. So just under 22% are in leadership roles, 3% are CEOs, 15% are CFOs, and 21% are COOs. And when you often look at that landscape, you often see that that the women in those executive committees are maybe head of HR or head of legal. I think on the fund management side, 11% of global fund managers are women. And of all the assets that are managed exclusively by women, it's 4%. And that's versus 85% for men. And then when you look at the financial advice and wealth management business, female advisors are outnumbered by male counterparts by somewhere around 8-1. So there is still a significant way to go. And gender equality in the workplace is no new concept. It's been around a long time, and we have seen progress over the decades, albeit from a low base. But I think what worries us is that not only is it not getting better now, but there are signs that it's got worse over the last year. So what do we do about it? Firstly, we stop fixing the women. In recent times, the approach has really been about fixing the women. Initiatives have been focused on things like increasing presence or increasing confidence or being more assertive. Or to maybe put it another way, maybe being a little bit more like a man. It was interesting, I was coaching a manager at one of the newspapers not so long ago. He ran a team of 28 people. He had 14 women and 14 men. And they had to rate themselves as part of their annual review process. And he asked me, he said, how can I make my women more confident? Because he'd had to mark down the men who had mostly scored themselves at a 5 out of 5, which was that far exceeding expectations. And he had to mark up women who had scored themselves mostly at 3, which was fully meeting expectations. And I thought it asked the question, is this about underconfident women, or is it about overconfident men? Because here's the thing. Women don't need fixing. There's nothing wrong with them. Most of them are brilliant. And instead of looking at fixing the women, we really need to be thinking about the system itself. And what I mean by that is the context in which women's careers have emerged. Now, there's a really good research study which we find helpful to help people understand what's been happening to women's careers over the last decades. So this is a research done by 2 US academics called Mainiero and Sullivan. And the researchers found 3 elements that people want to feature in their career: challenge, authenticity, and balance. Now, challenge was really about achieving and getting as much experience under your belt as possible, really starting to accelerate through your career. Whereas authenticity in that middle phase was much more about putting meaning or making your mark, doing something that chimes with your values. And then finally, it was about the search for balance. And that's more about making relational decisions about your career. So how does your career fit in with your life? Now, the researchers found that for individuals on the linear path, which they found to be the traditional male path, they typically find that they go through challenge, authenticity, and balance in that order, in that sequence. where it's in the mid phase of their careers that they might seem to really turbocharge, and they're really focused on achieving their ambitions, their promotions. And it's actually really towards the third phase of their careers that they might recognize that there's more to life maybe than just the career. So they start to prioritize their lives outside of work. Now, the researchers noted a very different pattern where all three elements were in play at each stage, and that was found more commonly with women. They coined it the kaleidoscope path because at each stage, one of those elements is dominating, but as you move stage, the picture changes, just as if you would move a kaleidoscope. Now, in the beginning, it doesn't look so very different because it's challenge. So that feels like it's about accelerating, grabbing the opportunities, but it's in the middle phase where things start to look different. Balance tends to dominate, and you can see the differences really start to emerge, especially versus the linear path. Now, balance means different things for different people, but it's about making relational decisions about your career and the need for your career to fit into your life. Now, I think it's quite obvious in terms of when you become a parent, especially a mum, having those competing priorities. But interestingly, the researchers found that this was the case regardless of whether women had children. Now, the later phase is the search for authenticity and meaning, really wanting to make a mark and often leave a legacy. And for many individuals, this is where they're re-energized, they have renewed focus on their career. And I'm really, really hoping, so my kids are now 13 and 10, and I'm really hoping that I'm nearly at the authenticity stage. Not sure I'm quite there yet. Now, the research was done in 2006, so it's 15 years old, it's retrospective, and of course it's a generalization. But interestingly, the researchers repeated that research 10 years later, and they found a significant difference. They found that both Gen Y women and men recognized and related to the kaleidoscope path. So it's not just 50% of the workforce, it's now 100% of a generation who recognize that kaleidoscope path. And the challenge for employers, I think particularly in the more traditional sectors like financial services, is that many organizations' career structures have been built around that linear path where you turbocharge in that middle phase. And that's where you often feel that real tension in the middle stage with the balance dominating. Now at ECC, most of the people we coach are in that middle phase, often at the point where they're becoming a parent. And originally, when we started parental transition coaching in 2006, companies were hemorrhaging women at this stage. But I'm very pleased, we're relieved to say that 15 years later, that flow has been stemmed. And now the coaching is now a lot less about retention and it's much more about development. But the challenge still remains because what we see is while women are largely staying in the workplace after having kids, they often change the trajectory of their career path. Now, it's understandable, you might say, you've got two jobs, you've got competing priority, you haven't got the bandwidth to take on more responsibility. But I might actually push back on that a little bit. I think often we see that it serves you better to move up a level rather than getting stuck in the doing. Think about all the skills that you learn as a new parent, even if you don't realize you're doing it, the 80-20 rule, the ruthless prioritizing. You have to be decisive and you have to delegate. I mean, you delegate the care of your child. And once you've done that, you can delegate anything. And these are all core leadership skills. So we look to try and reframe their experience as being more about leadership development and actually taking those skills that you've learned in a very different environment and applying them to your career. Now, one of the things that's synonymous with balance is the notion of working more flexibly. Now, the school of thought had been that this was, if not a silver bullet, it would most certainly contribute to solving the problem. We were definitely subscribers to that school of thought. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, when all the white collar workers were sent home, we thought, oh, maybe, just maybe, this is going to be an amazing global experiment. But 15 months later, and we've seen many more women fall out of the workforce than men. And one of the primary problems, if not the primary problem, is that we don't have gender equity at home. And this was never so obvious as with homeschooling. And I think a lot of it is that it was not only that it wasn't gender equity, but we were also crisis working versus flexible working. You know, one of my coachees said to me, she goes, "Oh, Helen, it's like parenting at work." And it really resonated with me because I thought, you know what, you're so right. When I was in investment banking, you used to be able to take your kids into work 1 day a year. You take them in and you weren't expected to get anything done that day. You really weren't expected to get anything done. And that's been our reality for all those lockdown months. You're parenting at work. So it wasn't really flexible working in the true sense. But I think one big concern for me going forward is this prospect of a two-tier workforce. For those organisations who do allow employees to choose where they work, we are probably more likely to see more women working at home, the ability to do drop off and pick up, no commuting. It has in some ways made life easier, even though the boundaries have been blurred. But at the same time, the action still happens in the office, especially if it's where the senior and mainly male leaders are. So my concern is that flexible working may actually exacerbate the gender divide. So that's a little bit about the organisational context. But the home piece also plays a very, very important role. Firstly, I think it's important to recognise that being in a dual career couple is now the norm. I think US and Europe, the number is a 65%. In the UK, 75% of both partners work, and the trend is consistently upwards. Now, one obvious reason for that is economics. But here's an interesting thing. When I'm coaching mums and they're weighing up their childcare options, they often talk about the cost. They add it up and then they take it away from their individual salary rather than the family income. You know, I'm practically working for nothing is something I hear a lot. And I think the danger is that this is very short-term thinking. Because I think also you need to bear in mind that women are often with partners who are slightly older than them, maybe 2 or 3 years or 3 or 4 years. And that means they're 2 or 3 or 4 years further along with their careers with the consequent salary bump. So if your decision is based purely on who earns more, especially if you're deducting the childcare cost off your salary, you may well be doing yourself a disservice. I think on the other side, our experience also tells us that there are many, many men who end up doing a job they hate because they're the primary breadwinner. So my advice here is to ask yourselves, how can we make this work? Not how am I going to do it and how are you going to help me, but how can we make this work? And then have deliberate, intentional conversations about it. How are you going to prioritize your careers and divide your family commitments? But I don't want to depress you. I don't want to depress you. There are definitely things we can do. So here are a few pointers of what we can do. And the first is men as allies. Now, I've kind of alluded to that if your partner is male at home with you, but also, you know, so having those intentional and deliberate conversations at home, but also educating our children about stereotypes, pointing out the pink and the blue world. I mean, I had a really interesting conversation with my 13-year-old son. I was actually writing my bio for this, and he was looking over my shoulder, and I said, "Oh, what do you think?" And he went, "Oh, Mummy," he goes, "you sound so impressive, because you sound like you should be wearing a suit and tie." And I thought, oh, wow. So I sound impressive, and you think I should be dressed as a man. That's what you're picturing. So my husband's like, "Oh, leave him alone." But I think it was a good opportunity to have that conversation about the stereotype. That was the first thing that came to mind for him. Now at work as well, men as allies, essential part of the puzzle. The problem might be female shaped, but the solution is gender neutral, for sure. You need to educate the men about the sorts of challenges that women face as they navigate their careers and help them to spot when this is happening to the women who work for them or with them. Now, gender stereotypes are often carved out. There's an image of a leader who typically embodies masculine qualities, or I should say maybe embodies typically masculine qualities: assertive, confident, authoritative. Some of the training that I was alluding to with Fix the Women, in fact. Whereas stereotypical views of a woman often perceive her as friendly, caring, or unselfish. But if a woman does happen to fit those masculine leadership qualities, such as being assertive, she'll typically end up in a double bind. And essentially, it often comes down to being a trade-off between competence and likability. I don't know whether you've read Lean In. It was an old, the old book written by Sheryl Sandberg about 10, 12 years ago. But it's like the Harvard Business School study with Howard and Heidi. And essentially, they split half the class. They split the class in half. Half were given a description of a leader who was called Howard, and the other half was given the same description of the leader, but she was called Heidi. And the half that thought the leader was called Howard thought he sounded like a great guy that they'd love to work with. And the half that thought that the leader, and I say this description was word for word the same, thought that she sounded like a real pain to work for and they'd rather not, thank you. So it is, this double bind is something that is very real and it plays out all the time. And we can help our male colleagues to understand how they can sponsor, how they can encourage and aid the development of their female colleagues and call it out when they see it. Now, the other thing that we can do is increase our diversity, which has a knock-on impact on innovation. And it's really encouraging that there's, I think, genuine and growing understanding that to be able to solve complex problems, you need diversity of opinion. So it's really pushing the argument that it's commercially rather than morally advisable is starting to have some impact. And we've recently seen, you may have seen the headlines about Goldman's. They're no longer going to invest in startups that aren't diverse because they found that they fail faster and more frequently. And I'm also encouraged by the increasing importance of ESG in the corporate world, particularly in financial services on the asset management side. There is still a fair amount of greenwashing, yes, but I think the trend is clear. The other thing I want to highlight is the culture of overwork, or rather countering the culture of overwork. We are available 24/7. We are working 60-hour weeks or more. We've almost put work on a pedestal. It's almost like a religion. And the reality is that our brains are not designed for this. We need to be well rested. We need to nurture ourselves. And it's showing up in burnout and mental health issues. I think working from home this last year has blurred the boundaries even more. It's such a corporate focus, but there's still an awful lot that needs to change here. And essentially that culture of overwork is at the root cause of it. So something practical you can be doing in the meantime. So there's men as allies, there's thinking about the diversity piece of your company, your team. There's also thinking about how to counter that culture of overwork. But what we have done at ECC is we've put together some resources for you called Work, Family and You. You can find them on our website. You can see the link at the bottom. It's free and it's available to everyone. And whether you're thinking about becoming a parent, whether you are pregnant or expecting, whether you've got kids already who are older, and maybe you're part of that sandwich generation who has elderly parents as well as dependent children, or if you're managing someone that's a parent, this has a wealth of resources there that can help you with it. So I'd really encourage you, please do use it. As I say, it's free and there's loads of interesting information. And if any of you are particularly interested in diversity, equity and inclusion, or if you're in HR, then there's a whole section that has got loads of thought leadership, news, opinion, research, which I think you'll find really interesting. But I'd really recommend having a look at it, and it will give you a sense of what we do and how we approach the kind of support of working parents as they have their caring responsibilities throughout their careers. So I'm going to leave you there. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I hope that that's been interesting and has given you plenty to consider. Thank you.